I think that if more wonderful, amazing feats of engineering and technology were built here on American soil, a lot more Americans would just be enthusiastic about that. I think we need radical regulatory reform in this country, like almost start from scratch kind of level. I think that AI is going to make that increasingly obvious, because if we were cut off to supplies of certain minerals, we would just be in very serious trouble. I mean, no microelectronics.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey there. Welcome to the New Rules with Alan Pentz, where we help you navigate today's chaos with precision. Your host, Alan Pentz, has 25 years of experience working in business and government, and he knows how the old rules have fallen apart. Each episode, we'll explore how to thrive in this new landscape by mastering the new rules while everyone else is still figuring them out. Let's dive in.
All right. On the pod this week, we have a very special guest. Dean Ball is a resident fellow, right, at Revitalizing Center, and has a new position with the Foundation for American Innovation. Did I butcher both of those? Or
Close enough. Yeah. Foundation for American Innovation and the Revitalizing Center. Yeah.
So the reason I'm not in research, Dean, is I'm a little dyslexic, and that's why I became an entrepreneur. So just, even if I just said it right before we tape.
Well, it's a better use of your time anyway.
So, Dean, we were talking just before we got on. I've taken this view of where I see the world going. I think I wrote a piece called The Sleeper Awakens. The U.S. has been so powerful, so predominant for so long that we all got used to it and stopped paying attention to what was happening under the surface. And now we're seeing these reemerging challenges where China is heavily subsidizing manufacturing, and now it's the second largest economy in the world. And we have new global threats, and we're seeing deglobalization. And in response, we've had a lot of talk about tariffs, obviously, industrial policy, other mechanisms to maybe readjust our trade system. And you come from a little more center right, I guess maybe a little libertarian. I don't know how you'd want to describe it, but take where you recognize the importance of manufacturing and staying ahead, but come to it from a less statist viewpoint. So I wanted to just get like a broad overview of where you see the U.S., the importance of manufacturing, and how you're thinking at a 30,000 foot level about these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do come out of a kind of classical liberal, I've never called myself a libertarian, but a classical liberal tradition. Economists like Friedrich Hayek were very formative for me. And one of the things that relates to this discussion that Hayek is most famous for arguing is he wrote this essay called The Use of Knowledge in Society. And it's about why central planning is so difficult, because all of the knowledge for like how to do complex things in the economy and the context in local situations for how you should be pricing things, how many things you should make and what you should make, and all this kind of stuff. It's in the mind of millions of different people throughout a country, and not possible to centralize that knowledge in the mind of a regulator or a group of regulators. But the important thing about that, for purpose of manufacturing, is that also means knowledge about how to manufacture complex things is also distributed throughout an economy. It's not some discrete thing that you can just put into a book and explain to people. There's no textbook that tells you how do you manufacture a nuclear reactor. That doesn't exist. And part of the reason that we struggle so much to manufacture nuclear reactors in this country and many other things is that we simply forgot how to do it, because the people who did the work, who did build those things half a century ago, are dead or retired. And so there are many examples with nuclear projects, for example, where Westinghouse built this AP1000 reactor in Georgia. And there are examples from the development of that project where they were going over to the retirement home to 85-year-old, 90-year-old men who worked on these things in the 70s, because they're literally the only people that have this information. So one of the fundamental assumptions, I feel, in like the kind of 90s era globalization was, if we outsource the manufacturing to China, we'll still do the high level stuff. We'll have all the knowledge stuff will be done here in America. And it turns out it's surprising to me that libertarians have ever made that argument, because to me, it seems rather obvious that no, you will forget, because there's all kinds of really important knowledge that can't be written down, that isn't high level. It's not PhD. It's not academic. It's on the factory floor. And so I think that if a country wants to know how to manufacture things, it has to manufacture things. It's a pretty simple thing ultimately, but we ask ourselves why we have these problems with supply chains, why things are expensive, and why we can't produce enough munitions for the war in Ukraine. And it relates to this reason.
So taking that argument, then if we're in a system of Hayek's where price signal, no one can really understand all the stuff that's happening and the price signal is important concepts, why isn't the price signal telling us that we should just be focusing on healthcare and services, and we should focus on service productivity and not really worry about manufacturing because it's being done somewhere else and it's fine? So in a sense, it's like you're using the Hayek notion to say, hey, we'll forget how to do this stuff. But didn't the Hayek notion create the problem in the first place?
To a certain extent, I think Hayek wrote, first of all, it's worth noting, his most important work was in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So when he talked about free trade, America was the China. His first books were written in Europe, but for the most part, when Hayek talked about free trade, he was writing from the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. And certainly, I think his perspective was probably influenced by that factor. I don't think it would have occurred to him that a country like China, at the time that he was writing, it could have risen to the level that it did. At the same time, there's a lot that Hayek gets right. Like, I think that protectionist trade policy, while it can have a role, I think you got to be really careful with it because it can create very brittle industries. Government subsidized industries are brittle. Government protected industries are brittle. They're not usually internationally competitive. So I think that if we want to revitalize our manufacturing sector, we're not going to do it by being like China. I think that Chinese style policies are probably not really the way we want to go. We want to take advantage of the things that are fundamental American strengths, which is A, excellence in technology, and B, excellence in the private sector allocation of capital. And I think the role of government in that context is to use a variety of different policies to create the conditions where the private sector can do its thing.
So would you say, though, that like Chinese industrial policy, insofar as it was designed to put China at the center of increasingly advanced manufacture, has essentially been a success?
I would say, it's hard to say. It would be hard to argue that it hasn't been a success. It's been predicated on a lot of different things going right for them all at the same time. And those things might not continue to, right? First, you had a massive population coming online all at the same time. You had just the surge of global trade that was happening anyway. You had the end of the Cold War and the desire among, in particular, Western elites and policymakers to unite the whole world in arms and to, this argument, which everyone believed. If you and I were sitting here in 2001, we would both be agreeing that, of course, by trading with China more, they'll liberalize and they'll become more like us over time.
To be honest, I had this friend at the time who was a lawyer, Scott Narps in DC, and he was a little older. And he was like, why are we doing this? The Chinese are going to kill us. And I was at the bar in Moldova. I was arguing with him, like, of course we're going to bring them in. They're going to become Western. But that one guy, he knew. He was channeling his Ross Perot.
But I think basically the consensus at the time was like, no, this is going to be great for everyone. We're going to grow the pie, blah, 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 all that stuff. And to a certain extent, that's probably still true. I think the question is just, they benefited from that. They had a ton of catch-up growth. And the other thing that I think is extremely important is the timing of technology. A lot of my work is really the history of technology, in essence, is to what it comes down to. It's where I draw a lot of my inspiration. So if you look at the last major wave of capital investment into American manufacturing, there's one that's underway right now. But the one before that, the major one before that, was in the 80s. So a lot of American factories modernized in the 80s. And you saw productivity increases at that point and sustained throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. And then right around the early 2000s, the productivity peaks and then it just stagnates and actually falls in real terms. And the reason this is important is that was precisely at the time that the Chinese were building all their factories. So the Chinese factory wave, they've been doing this capital investment in the 2000s and the 2010s. But what that means is that their factories are just newer and they're built with the assumptions of modern technology, powerful computers and software and the internet and all this stuff. Those are all built into the assumptions oftentimes of how Chinese factories work. And they're not. You go to a machine shop in the United States. I've been to several.
I'm an investor.
Yeah, well, maybe you're an investor in a modern one, but there are machine shops that really don't look as though they've changed since the 70s. And I've been to factories where they manufacture fighter jets. You would think Ronald Reagan is the president. So it does have to do with a good example of this to think about also is payment infrastructure. So in the United States, most Americans carry around a credit card because we adopted the credit card in the 70s. We adopted it super early. And so every business has a credit card terminal. And when a waiter comes to you, you hand them a credit card and then they take your credit card and they go process it. In countries that are far poorer than the United States, they've had a way more technologically savvy experience with payments for years because they started integrating payment technology once smartphones had already proliferated. So if you go to Kenya, the Kenyans have more sophisticated, more fluid and flexible payments than Americans do. It's the same dynamic, but with factories going on between the US.
And in China, you have these super apps, right? Like you have Alipay and you have, I don't know if it's Tencent or which one has the super apps, but we don't, like it's spread everywhere. So I've heard that, I think Noah Smith, newsletter writer, wrote, you could say everything in China, like all the buildings are nice and new, and the concrete is clean, and yeah, it's just newer. It's going to look dirty like everything else in some aging city here in 10, 15 years, right? So take that point. I guess the thing I worry about is going back to that late 90s admission of China, the WTO, we kind of ignored the communist part of China. We're like, that's a bunch of crap they talk about, but it doesn't really matter. They're going to get out of it. They're going to get rich and they're going to like being rich just like we like being rich. And if you look, I don't know if you know, Tanner Greer has written some stuff about take the Chinese seriously as communists, and Xi in particular. And he's wedded this mythology about not mythology, about there was a century of humiliation from the Opium Wars to the end of the Second World War, where China was predated upon by Western powers, given unequal treaties. It's like them telling us we can't stop them importing fentanyl, right? So that's true. And she's wedded this materialist, production-oriented Marxist view, like everything's just about building more tech, to this sort of chauvinistic Chinese historical narrative. And it's like the result is we are going to do everything. We're going to take everyone's profits. We're going to suppress the wages of our people. We're going to take all of our capital and just put it into the most advanced technologies so that we are the center. We're the Britain. We're the America next. We own every advanced manufacturing sector, every technology sector. And so I think we need to take that seriously, that this is a Soviet level threat in some ways. I don't know how you react to that.
No, I completely agree. And look, at the end of the day, like there's the reality that a lot of people who are very smart, both inside and outside the military, the US military, assess that we will be at war with China before the end of this decade. And you have to take that seriously. You have to take stuff like that seriously. So I think military readiness is the kind of thing that goes beyond just economic principles. Obviously, like sometimes you have to decide which principles are more important. It matters what your priority is. And my priority is national defense.
But I might frame the question a little bit differently, right? So, and I think Greer's written about this, that China will fight for Taiwan. So yes, there is a military threat there. But he doesn't really see them as an expansionist military power. He sees them largely as an economic power that might use economic coercion rather than military force to get what they want outside of the Taiwan area. So I do think that we primarily view them as an economic or as a military threat in national security circles, but don't take as seriously the economic impacts that they can have.
I agree with that completely too. And here is basically what I would say is the problem with dealing with that. The challenge there is that American policymakers, and I think Americans in general, we get very excited about doing like the one big, really hard thing, right? Put a man on the moon. We're going to build a nuclear bomb. We're going to build a big, fancy, leading edge semiconductor manufacturing plant in Arizona. And they're going to make the best semiconductors in the world. They actually won't, but they'll make close to the best. And if you have someone like Tim Cook gave an interview more than a decade ago at this point, I believe, maybe a decade ago, CEO of Apple and famous. I mean, perhaps Tim Cook's, his legacy as the CEO of Apple. And before, when he was the chief operating officer under Steve Jobs, was moving Apple's manufacturing supply chain to China and building probably the most impressive manufacturing, like industrial supply chain in the world there. And what he said when he was asked, why don't you build the iPhone in America? It's not because we don't have some fancy manufacturing plant. Like we could build that. The problem is that there's all these basic services of manufacturing, machine tooling, tool and die making and casting and forging and things like this that the Chinese just have orders of magnitude more talent and capital and skill in compared to us. And so one of the things that I believe is that one way to go about revival, one of several that we should pursue for American manufacturing, is to really look at what are the foundational processes and services of manufacturing and how do we revitalize that, especially if we can find really technologically differentiated ways to do that would be a huge plus, because a lot of the things I'm talking about, some of them are 100 years old. Some of them are processes that really haven't changed in a century. So can we find better ways to do that stuff?
Leapfrog China the way they leapfrogged us, right? Because we don't have it anymore, really. So we can build something from whole cloth, really.
You don't have to worry about if we find a new way of doing tool and die making that requires 90% fewer staff. That's fine by our standards, because if we are really successful, it will still end up with more people employed in tool and die making than currently are. And they'll just make a lot more money because way higher labor productivity. So there are a lot, and the promising news here is that there are a lot of startups in every single one of those spaces that I just mentioned all across America that are doing really cool stuff. And so I think that if you build that infrastructure out, it's a lot like AWS was this network of data centers that Amazon built all over America. And what they really did at the end of the day was abstract away a lot of complexity. So if you wanted to launch a web app before AWS was really big, then you had to go get the servers yourself and configure them and figure out a physical location to put them. And if all of a sudden, if your web app was really popular, you had to scale up. Well, figuring out how to scale up, which is an extremely difficult challenge, that was all on you as the entrepreneur. And what Amazon, AWS and Microsoft Azure and Google Cloud, these other big hyperscalers, what they allowed entrepreneurs to do and many other businesses was simply abstract away the complexity. And so many of the startups that became big businesses of the last decade, Zoom, Airbnb, Uber, these companies like that, they were built on top of that infrastructure, physical infrastructure that we built in this country. And so I think that there's a possibility of really a whole new crop of manufacturing hardware startups for both the defense sector and the civilian sector and all kinds of industrial use cases that can be built on top of the infrastructure layer. So I think there's a lot of promise there, but it does, I think, require some thought to actually make it happen.
So you wrote, the first thing I'd read by you on Dean has an excellent blog, a Substack called hyperdimensional.com. So you should go definitely check that out. The first thing I saw you write on this was called America the Serious. And so you made a case that we need to get more serious about manufacturing is important. We need to get more serious about it. So give us an outline of what you think getting serious means.
Yeah. So I think I do more or less concur in a spiritual sense with the idea that, first of all, like as Elon Musk said last night when he showed off the new self-driving Teslas, the future should look like the future. It should be palpably different from the present. And making that happen, making the future a palpably different place from the present, involves physically putting it together. You have to physically build that. And in a world where we're not confident in our relationship with China, and also in a world where I think we want Americans to be techno-optimistic. I want Americans to be techno-optimistic. I think that if more wonderful, sort of amazing feats of engineering and technology were built here on American soil, a lot more Americans would just be enthusiastic about that. So I think it's a way to take more pride. But the one other thing I would say about it is just, again, the realization that there's a couple things happening over the next few years, decade or so, that I think really should make us understand that the next decade might be the most tumultuous period any of us have ever lived through. There's the geopolitical conflict with China, with other people. There's all kinds of conflicts around the world that are playing up. There's also something I write about, and most of my time writing about, is the rise of AI. And one of the things that I think will be true of AI is that it will enable us to do all kinds of amazing new things in the world. But I think an AI will be maybe able to come up with some really novel insights about how to do nuclear fusion or how to build a new type of nuclear fission reactor or a new type of spaceship or something. But it doesn't change the fact that the AI is on a server and it doesn't physically know how to build those things. It can't physically procure those materials. And so I think if we really want to take advantage of this technology that is going to entail a lot of challenges and a lot of tumult, we really want to maximize the good from it. I think we have to get good at building things.
So just on the things in the future should look like the future from Elon, I got a text right before our interview from my 16-year-old son who was like, "Did you see the event last night? The Tesla?" I was like, "Oh, the robotaxi thing." Yeah, robots too, and a van. And the van, no one besides Elon can make a van that looks like that. And that's 100% what he's responding to, is that it looks like the future. So I have a lot of hope for that. Your generation and the one after it, that it's like a new age for that. So what actually has to happen for us to get serious? Is there an agenda? Is there a policy? Is there, what is it that we need to do?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is definitely a huge area, and I'm by no means the only person thinking and writing about these things, but here's like my tentative thoughts. I think the first thing we should say is we should let the government do what the government is at least theoretically good at. And we should let the private sector do what we know it's good. And like one thing we know the private sector is good at, we're really good at allocating capital in America. And this is a problem that the Chinese have. They don't allocate capital as efficiently. And so what they have to do is if they get excited about some new thing, they play whack-a-mole with us, right? Like we still lead the way on where tech is going. And then they play whack-a-mole and in some cases catch up or even exceed us. But we have to spend like all this money to get in. And that's going to be fiscally constraining for them. Eventually their economy is not doing so well. So you should keep that dynamic in mind, first of all. I think that there's a problem in the capital markets though, which is that a lot of these industrial players sit in a weird place, which is like, it's a venture capital level risk, like it's a starting. And that also means that they probably shouldn't be taking in general, like a ton of debt. Like you want to raise equity because the primary thing is not getting paid back on a bond or like a loan or something. It's owning a share in this thing that you think is going to grow. That's the primary way to make money on it, investing in a company like this. But then at the same time, the return profile is not quite as high as software which is what VCs used to investing in, because they're making physical goods that, they're going to be variable cost. It's just not infinitely scalable overnight in the way that software is, or infinitely distributable to everyone in the world overnight. It just takes time and it takes capital. So it's a little bit weird. So there are these things, I won't go into too much wonky detail, but what I will say is that there are a variety of mechanisms that the federal government has, and also state governments, I should say, have to subsidize a little bit those investors' returns, to pump up their returns like a few percentage points so that it's more appealing to investors And the government makes its money back, by the way, from this. So the government's not spending money in theory. It gets its principal of its investment returned to it.
This is like SBIC kind of stuff, or
Yeah, SBICs would be an example. That's how the small business investment corporations are vehicles created by the federal government in the 50s.
they get matching funds for loans and equity, right? But a lot of venture capital firms started that way, essentially, right?
Yes, that's what seeded the modern VC industry in the late 50s. So things like that are definitely on the table. We do a lot of industrial policy already in America. We do it through the defense industrial base, number one, and we do it through state economic development, number two. State governments spend a huge amount of money on economic development, and no one actually really knows how they spend this money. It's not very well documented, but I think there's all kinds of work that can be done on both of those things. The most difficult part about the defense thing is you just need to reform procurement rules, because the procurement rules are like a total mess. Yeah, very difficult to work with.
So, Dean, I think what you're talking about here is really, you said, hey, we're about to go into this decade, the most tumultuous. And then you describe this technological change. And by the way, even AI, people are now questioning, is this really a software-like return? I mean, the inference costs of a one model, right, they're highly variable, right? And they're a lot. Maybe that changes over time, but we have serious power limitations, electricity limitations to serve that up. So there's a lot of the cost model in the economy seems to be shifting as you're seeing potentially the value of software starting to move towards zero, right? If people can just use AI tools, not today, but maybe you're seeing the beginning of this. So we're talking about some really tumultuous changes where like our capital markets or everything is shifting and everyone's going to have to reorient themselves. And you go look at the Defense Department and I'm sure it's like knives out bloodbath in front of the appropriations and Armed Services Committees, like with the old players trying to hold out against the annuals and Palantirs and the others.
Well, and one other thing I should mention on that front, the two things. First of all, permitting reform is a big other important part of this at both local, state, and federal level.
Put a stake in the heart of NEPA.
All of it. Yeah, tons of it. I mean, I personally think we need radical regulatory reform in this country, like almost start from scratch kind of level. I think, by the way, I think that AI is going to be is going to make that increasingly obvious that our laws are just fundamentally outdated.
I think it is the forcing function that breaks the back of the environmental lobby to a certain extent. That's a great thing.
I think that will happen. I hope, at least. That's going to be a huge problem because if you believe my general thesis that, AI is going to be, there's going to be all this opportunity for new things that you can build using much more powerful AI systems than we have today that I think will exist in a few years from now. Well, one of the implications of that is it's software. So we're not going to be able to keep it out of the Chinese hand like forever, probably, or like for a particularly long time. And so if we're not building the future with it, the Chinese will build the future with it. And so I think to be even remotely competitive, if the value of knowledge work is going down and we have a knowledge-based economy, we got to do something about that. So I think manufacturing is extremely important for that reason. The last thing that the government can do that I think is really useful, at least that occurs to me, is basic research and basic kind of scientific infrastructure that can be really useful. Like one thing that would be amazing for all kinds of advanced manufacturing purposes is if we could lower the cost of discovering, characterizing, and synthesizing new materials by like multiple orders of magnitude. That would be really amazing. And we're on the cusp of it. There's AI models that can predict material structures, chemical structures, molecular structures that potentially have certain characteristics. And then it's a matter of figuring out how to make it. And a lot of that is an experimental process. And a lot of those experiments can be automated in something called a self-driving lab, just robotic lab, basically. So I have a piece coming out, I think pretty soon, that is going to advocate for the U.S. government to build self-driving labs Now, these would be smaller scale, but the idea is if the federal government can build something that's larger than anyone else has built, and because people have built these exist at very small scale. But I think like scaling up to the next level is a great idea. We can de-risk the technology, get some best practices going that can be shared so that hopefully eventually private sector actors build these things too. And then we can all of a sudden be discovering all kinds of crazy materials. One of my theories is just that if you want the future to look meaningfully different from the present, like material science is a big part of how you get there. It's like room temperature superconductor, things like that, right? Like they allow you to build really sci-fi kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's cool. Like to continue my family thing, I have a nephew in England, UK, who's just finished his master's in material science. His thesis was using machine learning to discover new materials and then rank them by feasibility of production. And just talking to him about, hey, look, you've got to go to the States for your PhD because that's where this is going to happen. And we've got to invest in that sector. It's crucial. So 100%. So if I summarize, let's use the government for these we have a good history of providing cheaper capital or subsidized capital or something like that. But really we're providing it to private sector, profit motivated players who can allocate capital, but we're helping them subsidize the cost of potentially doing things that have a more physical structure, more variable costs, that aren't the traditional necessarily just software model. Permit reform, where we need to build, if you look at the Chinese electricity production curve, it's like this, and ours has been like on a straight line since 1971. We've got to get permit reform so we can build these things, build capacity in the country. And then finally, the government has a huge role in just funding basic R&D, right? To get the base technologies. And some of these, maybe there's basic facilities, right? That, like you mentioned, the labs. So that would be the 3-point agenda.
There's also, I would say, to add 2 more, there's the defense industrial base, which I think especially some of those very basic services of manufacturing that I mentioned, like casting and tool and die, machine tooling, these kinds of things. I think if you do it right, that's the kind of thing that the federal government can help scale up. There are existing startups, and like, how do you give those people the ability to scale up? I think the federal government already has authorities to do that. It doesn't need new laws passed to do that. And then I think, in fairness, I say this as a Mercatus scholar. Mercatus is a libertarian think tank, but I think that the tactical use of trade policy can make sense for sure.
All right, Brian Kaplan's head just exploded.
Yeah, I don't think we should be doing it willy-nilly. And I think, for example, like the steel tariffs are really dumb. So I think you got to be really careful about it. And it's especially valuable. Like, I think where the tariffs can specifically make the most sense, if you have a country like China, which we know that what they do is they steal the intellectual property from American companies and then they build on that and they scale it. And yes, they have very smart researchers there who then, with a lot of government investment and subsidy and all these kinds of things, they can actually exceed us. So that, like, the Chinese are better than the Americans at batteries and solar panels and that anyone else in the world probably at batteries and solar panels. They're trying to achieve that with semiconductors. We don't know. Right now they haven't, but that's what they're trying to achieve. And I think when they do that kind of stuff, I think if all the rich economies of the world band together and say no, and refuse to buy that stuff or impose very stark tariffs on that kind of stuff, I think that sends a signal, and I think it stops the behavior. And that's the problem, is the behavior. And the thing is that nobody in the world will, like, the Chinese want it, obviously, but the Chinese thought, oh, well, these decadent Westerners are just stupid to realize that we're just going to become the whole factory. And it worked for a while. And to Donald Trump's credit, he's the one who woke everyone in the world up to this. And there's certain things now that are consensus because of Donald Trump from people who otherwise think Donald Trump is the worst person who's ever lived.
It will be his greatest accomplishment, I think.
I think so too. Certainly so far. And because it's all over the world. It's not even just in America. It's all over the world. And it's like people who are just like, wait, like, we have domestic industry. We can't just forfeit everything to the Chinese and buy stuff from China. What are we going to do? This isn't even just rich countries, right? China has these problems. I pay really close attention, for whatever reason, to China's sort of economic engagement in Africa and the global South. And you see the same thing there. I mean, it's like you have African countries being like, no, we make this stuff.
Well, so I think Pakistan just put on steel tariffs against them too. So
Exactly. One final thing I will say that is extremely important that I didn't mention. I don't know a ton about it, but there's this think tank called Employ America, which has done a really wonderful report on this about minerals in particular, about mining and refining minerals. We got a ton of them, but it's not a problem of, for the most part, have all the natural resources we need in this country or like on this continent, certainly including allies. What we need the ability to do much more is refine them. And that just is heavy industry. That's heavy, ugly, nasty industry. And so we just got to do it. I know some really cool people that are doing some high tech, like it's magnesium refining. But yeah, like we need a lot more stuff like that. And that's the kind of thing that we need. Because if we were cut off to supplies of certain minerals, we would just be very serious trouble in all sorts of, no microelectronics.
So I do take your point. I mean, I would push a little more on the trade side. So as I mentioned, I'm an investor in a machine shop up in Massachusetts, some guns, a small investor, not control, Cheryl. And what I see is this infrastructure of manufacturing exists in Massachusetts, actually, oddly enough. I didn't know this, but there is a hollowing out of just baseline manufacturing. And a lot of the new stuff, the cutting edge stuff, it's very project based. It goes up and down and up and down. And it's really the base level stuff of making some stupid coupling that goes into a wire that hooks into your computer, whatever it is, right? That's the bread and butter, this kind of thing, right? That's the bread and butter of manufacturing. And you've got to have that baseline for these guys to survive. But I take the point, on the other hand, when they took over this thing, it's run on like filing system that some deranged maniac came up with over 40 years, right? With all paper, like in different file cabinets. They're now implementing software to do pricing and jobs, but nobody buys the software because they're all retrograde. And almost every one of these people is 75 years old and like barely hanging on to, I don't even know if these places can stay open.
That's a very common story.
And look, they're trying to buy some other places and the story is the same. One place after the next. These guys are all operating at a thin margin, and real estate's actually probably their best investment. And I do think we need to take a serious look. Now, I agree tariff policies, it's incredibly leaky. It has a lot of negative effects. And I credit Trump with discovering, highlighting the problem, not coming up with the best solution. So I think we do need to think about things like capital controls, not allowing China to manipulate its currency. I don't know what exactly it is, but we have to, a lot of these places, they continue to lose business to China. So it's happening. And I think there's a part of me that thinks like that is a huge problem and we haven't figured that part out. And if we have an open capital account, open markets, and an open free trade, I don't know. I don't know if the investment in this new stuff is going to do it, get us there.
There are lots of people who have put thought into the tax dimension of all this, and I haven't myself yet, but I want to at some point. Is there anything you can do on the tax code that like I would be cool with as a classical liberal? Is there anything you could do on the tax code that would help here? Because the thing about the tax code is if any libertarian tries to tell me, oh, well, we can't do that, that will distort the economy. Well, look at the tax code, right? It's 1 million pages long, right? Like the economy is already distorted by our tax code, and that's not going to change because we do one thing.
And I followed James Petacoukas with his blog, and he's at AI, and there's a scholar there, I can't remember his name right off the top of my head. He just came out with a report basically saying all our industrial policy and tariff policy was a waste and didn't do anything. From a very traditional, whatever you call it, libertarian neoliberal tape. And he's just saying that it's all distorting everything and it's terrible. And it's like, well, first of all, our economy has been distorted by industrial policy from a variety of countries, starting with Japan and Germany and now China for decades. Like, this isn't like exactly a new thing. Yes, I get that the policies weren't very well designed, but I just don't think we can close our eyes to the fact that if you lose this base, you're in trouble.
The other thing I think I would say to that is look at how much money we spend on the production tax credit in this country, right? Like the wind turbine. We subsidize like wind and solar and stuff like that.
I'm also an investor in a solar company as well. So, okay, you get a bunch of back plates for it. Spend a lot of money. Goldman Sachs said that the investment tax credit, I think just for solar, they're estimating over 10 years, $1.4 trillion.
Well, so there's the investment tax credit, and then there's the production tax credit, which is paid on a unit of energy basis to power producers. And that stuff, it can be enormously expensive. It creates all kinds of crazy distortions. Like, for example, they will, in wind turbines, because the production tax credit stops applying if the equipment in the turbine is more than a certain period of time old, perfectly good motors inside of turbines will be replaced at millions of dollars of ultimately taxpayer expense, because it's utilities. Ultimately, the taxpayer is paying for this electricity that these turbines are generating and the capital investment. And they're only being replacing the stuff inside the wind turbines because of the production tax credit. So if you were to take 20% of that trillions of dollar outlay over the next decade, not to mention what we've already spent over the past decade, what else could you do with that if what you cared about is manufacturing?
So your point is basically, hey, we're distorting the economy anyway, so let's just take it from one distortion and put it into a more productive distortion. So I thought we were going to disagree about that. Well, feeling a lot of agreement here. So I've kept you probably to time, but give us a quick, you did another blog on going to El Segundo that the kids are calling Gundo now, just south of LA, which is a center for space and military technology. So give us a quick general sense of, and just on a hopeful note of what's going on there.
Yeah. So El Segundo's an amazing place. It's a little independent city, but within Los Angeles. It was home quite famously to a major fighter jet production facility. So 6 months after Pearl Harbor, there's this facility that's now owned by Northrop Grumman. They still make planes there. But, this facility was under construction 6 months after Pearl Harbor. 6 months after that, so with 1 year anniversary of Pearl Harbor, this facility was producing one plane, one fighter jet every 15 minutes. Thousands of planes, right? Just huge output. Nowadays, the same facility also produces fighter jets. It produces like 22 a year. So there's this kind of the bad side of industrial decay and stagnation and all that stuff. But because it has all these great facilities, all these great manufacturing facilities of all sorts of different sizes, and because the mayor in El Segundo is this incredibly smart and forward-thinking and energetic guy, and also because SpaceX was founded in El Segundo, so it has this kind of famous legacy to it. It's become a hub for all sorts of startups that are doing some of the coolest stuff I've ever seen in my life. So if you want to talk about basic manufacturing service type stuff, they've got people doing that. Got people making hypersonic missiles and nuclear reactors and rockets and repurposed rockets that can make electricity and all kinds of other amazing stuff. And it's, for the most part, almost entirely young people doing it. I mean, startup founders, right? Most of them are younger than me. And they're just doing these incredible things. And they all just want to make a change in the physical world. And it's a really inspiring place to see.
Did you see something cool you could talk about?
Yeah, I've saw a lot of cool stuff. I think there's one company that I have to say, and full disclosure, I've done some work with this company, but they are super cool. They're called Rangeview. They do investment casting. So what that basically is you make a mold of a part, and then you pour molten metal into that mold in order to make the final part. What they do is they use this ceramic 3D printing process. They basically make this goo. It's like this goo that's made out of sand and plastic, and they put it in a 3D printer and they shine lasers, the goo. And when you do that in just the right way, the nature of reality is such that apparently you can turn that into shapes of arbitrary complexity. And so what they can do is they can make parts, investment cast, and not everything is made with that. Investment castings are for high-end parts, like rocket, turbines and rockets and stuff like that, very high-end parts. But they can do it for the same quality level an order or two of magnitude less cost, because they don't have to do the traditional way of doing it, which is 100 years old, is this kind of fixed way. There's 6 figures of fixed cost involved.
It's like the old movable type printing press or something like that.
Yeah, versus a word processor in a lot of ways where you can just print stuff. That's basically what they're doing. There's a great, if you follow defense news at all, you will often see that there are fighter jets in our fleet that are grounded in maintenance for 6 months, 8 months, really long periods of time. And oftentimes what's happening there is some random stupid part in that fighter jet that has failed. Some small part, not like a $50 million thing, just a small, tiny thing has failed and they're waiting for casting. And it costs $250,000 and it takes 6 months to do for a lot of the same reasons. It's all on paper also, and it's all 75-year-old dudes who are on the verge of retirement who are doing this stuff. And so they're bringing some new energy to that. That's some very cool stuff.
And are the lasers shaping it or are they like hardening it?
Yeah, it's basically, if you look at it, it looks like it's a normal 3D printer. It's like a 3D printer it's not a normal, it's actually not a normal 3D printer. It's heavily custom engineered 3D printer by them. But yeah, I mean, just to a layman, it just looks like a 3D printer that they're using.
Very cool. Well, Dean, thank you so much for being on. So first of all, people can get you on hyperdimensional.co. Where else should they look out for you?
You can find me on Twitter. I'm at Dean W. Ball, like baseball.
Awesome. Well, Dean, thank you so much for being on. Talk soon.
Thank you, Alan. This was fun.
You've been listening to The New Rules with Alan Pentz. For more insights on mastering the new game, follow at Pentz, that's APENTZ, on X, and make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, in today's world, you don't follow the rules, you write them.